Welcome again. I'm really glad you're here. When we talk about focus, we're not just talking about willpower or sitting still. We're talking about biology. We're talking about how your brain, your body, and your environment converge into a state where you can see clearly, think deeply, and act intentionally. When we talk about attention, it's not simply a matter of willing ourselves to sit still or look harder. Instead, we're engaging a finely tuned biological orchestration inside the brain, a choreography of chemicals, circuits, and timing. At the heart of this orchestration are two vital neuromodulators, dopamine and norepinephrine, sometimes called noradrenaline. Understanding how they work gives you access to the practical ability to optimize your capacity to focus. Begin with dopamine. When a neuron releases dopamine into the synaptic space, it targets specific receptors, D1, D2, etc., and this action modulates many things: reward expectation, motivation, working memory, and the readiness to engage. Springer Link 1, it's often framed in terms of pleasure or reward, but in the context of attention, dopamine plays a role as a signal saying, "This matters, attend now." When dopamine is optimally tuned in prefrontal cortex and striatal circuits, you'll find yourself more likely to begin, persist, and complete cognitive tasks. When it's too low or misregulated, attention fades, interest drops, distractibility rises. That's why in conditions like ADHD, disrupted dopamine signaling is one of the key features. ADA2, norepinephrine, is the other critical piece. It largely originates from a small nucleus in the brainstem, the locus ceruleus LC. That structure broadcasts norepinephrine widely into cortex, especially prefrontal regions. Picower Institute 3, when low-level or tonic firing dominates the LC, the brain is in a state of relative rest. Attention is diffuse, not sharp. When phasic bursts of LC activation occur, sudden increases of norepinephrine enhance signal-to-noise and cortical networks, distracting inputs are suppressed, and task-relevant inputs are amplified. In simplified terms, norepinephrine helps you filter out what's irrelevant and amplify what matters. A recent study using optogenetic activation of LC neurons demonstrated this directly. Boosting LC output improved the mouse's ability to ignore distractions and complete attentional tasks. Picower Institute 3. But there's a nuance here. Both too little and too much of either neuromodulator can degrade focus. Research shows an inverted U-shaped relationship. Moderate, well-timed levels of dopamine and norepinephrine support optimal attention. Extremes, either under or overactivation, impair it. Springer Link 1, for example, excessive norepinephrine during high stress may bind low-affinity receptors and disrupt working memory circuits in the prefrontal cortex. Meanwhile, deficient dopamine means that "this matters" signal never fires strongly, and the brain drifts toward default mode, distractions, or autopilot. Now let's consider how these two systems work together. When you face a task requiring deep attention, say writing, complex problem-solving, or sustained learning, norepinephrine primes the system. It raises alertness, increases the gain on sensory input, sharpens cortical responsiveness. Simultaneously, dopamine issues the motivational payoff signal. The brain interprets that this activity is important and will engage the circuitry for sustained effort, memory storage, reward prediction. The interplay means you're not just awake, you're purposefully engaged. In cognitive neuroscience terms, frontostriatal and frontocerebellar loops are modulated by these monoamines to support working memory, cognitive flexibility, and attentional control. Publications list 4. It's also crucial to recognize how context, timing, and brain state influence this chemistry. The LC norepinephrine system is high, sensitive to salience, novelty, and environmental cues. If your environment is full of competing stimuli, the LC may flicker between phasic and tonic states and attention becomes fragmented. On the dopamine side, if the immediate task yields little discernible reward or novelty, the brain may not release sufficient dopamine to sustain engagement and focus wanes. That means your internal chemistry depends on your external setup, environment, novelty, clarity of goal, timing after waking, sleep quality, even your breathing and body state. Practically speaking, when you want to engage deep focus, you're engineering conditions favorable to these neuromodulators. You want moderate arousal, not stress, clarity of goal, so dopamine maps value to the task, a minimal distraction field so norepinephrine can support selective attention, and a readiness state in body and brain. The chemistry doesn't magically turn on. You set up the conditions and the brain responds. Finally, the takeaway: attention isn't solely a mental act. It's a biologically anchored state. By understanding how dopamine and norepinephrine converge in your neural circuits, you reclaim agency over your ability to focus. You become the conductor of your own neurochemical orchestra, ensuring the spotlight of attention shines where you intend, for as long as you intend. That knowledge transforms focus from a passive hope into an active skill. When your eyes scan a room, your skin senses the textures around you, your ears pick up faint hums. Your brain doesn't just receive this barrage of inputs like a camera catching stills. Instead, it orchestrates a dynamic process of sensory gating and visual engagement, a biological system that filters, prioritizes, and magnifies the inputs your brain needs in the moment. It's this system that underpins real focus, turning raw sensory data into meaningful, actionable information. Start with sensory gating. At its core, sensory gating is the brain's natural mechanism for reducing the neural response to repeating or irrelevant stimuli. You've heard of the phenomenon. You walk into a room, a clock is ticking, you notice it at first, but after a moment you don't. That happens because your brain has gated out the repetitive noise. Research shows that the neural response, for example, the P50 or N100 event-related potential in auditory or other sensory modalities, is reduced when an identical stimulus is presented in quick succession, PMC1. In short, your brain suppresses what it judges is redundant to preserve resources for what matters. But this filtration isn't purely automatic, it's strongly modulated by attention. In other words, the gating threshold, what gets let in, what gets filtered out, is dynamically shaped by your goals, your state, your environment. Studies using somatosensory paired pulse stimuli show that when attention is directed to the somatosensory domain, gating of early theta band responses is increased while gating of alpha and beta responses is decreased. PMC2, what this means, when you intend to receive and process a specific sensory stream, your brain adjusts its gating in real time. It doesn't just passively receive, it actively prioritizes. Now overlay onto that the visual system's role in engagement. Your visual system is perhaps the dominant gateway through which you engage focus. When you fixate, when you reduce extraneous motion, you reduce the demands on your brain's broad attentional networks and enable more selective processing. Neural signatures such as the visual non-component reflect how attention enhances sensory gain for relevant regions of the visual field. Wikipedia 3, when you look intentionally, not just glance, you increase the amplitude of early visual potentials in target areas, meaning more robust processing of what you are aiming to perceive and less waste on what you're ignoring. The interplay is critical when your eyes engage deliberately. The sensory gating system is primed to filter out the irrelevant visual noise, flickering lights, peripheral movement, competing stimuli in your field of view, and allow the signal you care about to rise above the noise floor. Simultaneously, attention reinforces that what you're looking at is meaningful, which elevates the brain's readiness to process deeply. In an environment saturated with stimuli, the visual system's ability to anchor focus becomes a biological backbone for sustained attention. Consider how this plays out in practice. Imagine you're about to engage in a deep cognitive task, reading technical material, writing, coding. If your screen is surrounded by motion, notifications blinking, ambient light flickering, your visual system is overloaded, your sensory gating mechanism is taxed by redundant inputs, and thus cannot concentrate fully on the task-relevant stimuli. On the other hand, if you fix your gaze on the text, reduce extraneous motion, and minimize peripheral flicker, you're aligning your visual engagement and gating system in your favor. Your brain shifts from broad scan and filter mode to focused receive and process mode. Moreover, how you direct your visual attention matters. Studies on visuospatial attention and sensorimotor gating reveal that the laterality of visual input and attentional condition influence gating efficacy. Frontiers 4, what this highlights. Your spatial orientation, gaze direction, and attentional allocation aren't simply behavioral. They influence neural gating networks. When you decide consciously where to look, you're shaping how your brain filters incoming data. So what are the actionable takeaways? First, set up your visual field for focus. Choose a stable gaze point, reduce motion in the periphery, simplify your visual environment. Second, reduce competing sensory inputs, muted notifications, stable lighting, minimal visual clutter. Third, engage attention intentionally. Before you dive into a task, take a moment to center your gaze and tell your brain, this is my target now. That act itself shifts gating dynamics. Your brain receives a cue. The filter tightens, relevant data gets amplified, irrelevant data gets dampened. In sum, sensory gating is your brain's early stage filter. Visual engagement is the primary door through which high-resolution focus enters. Together, they form the neural architecture of attention. When you align your gaze, your environment, and your intention, you prime your brain to operate not in a distracted firefight of stimuli, but in a sharp, directed mode of high signal reception. That's how you move from being pulled by your environment to steering your attention. When we think about alertness, real, sustained alertness that powers creativity, productivity, focus, we often reduce it to caffeine, mantra, or brute will. In truth, alertness is deeply rooted in our biology. It's the product of two intertwined systems, the circadian clock and the contextual cues we layer on top of it. These systems are not optional extras. They are foundational to how the brain functions, how performance waxes and wanes, and how we can optimize our capacity to engage deeply rather than drift. Our internal clock is governed by the suprachiasmatic nucleus SCN, a bundle of 20,000 neurons in the brain's hypothalamus that receive direct input from the eyes about ambient light and then synchronize countless peripheral clocks throughout the body. Harvard Medical School 1. That system sets the timing for hormone release, body temperature, metabolic signals, and the gating of brain states that favor either wakefulness or rest. For example, alertness isn't constant over the 24 hours. It rises and falls, shaped by the circadian rhythm as well as the accumulation of time awake homeostatic sleep pressure, PMC2. What this means functionally is that your brain has windows of heightened readiness and windows where alertness naturally dips. Studies show that attentio, null processes, working memory, and executive functions follow this rhythm. They peak and trough in sync with our biological clock, rather than simply with how long we've been awake. Nupsi key 3, so if you try to force yourself to be sharp when your system is biologically winding down, you're swimming upstream against physiology. On the flip side, when you plan your high-focus work to align with your circadian up phase, you're playing into your brain's design. But circadian timing alone isn't determinative. It only sets the baseline. Contextual cues, light exposure, physical movement, posture, diet, environment act as modulators. For instance, the light hitting your eyes in the morning functions as a powerful Zeitgeber, time giver. Exposing your eyes to natural light soon after waking tells your SCN it's daytime alertness mode on. Conversely, late evening light, especially blue-rich artificial light, sends a conflicting signal and delays the transition towards sleep and rest, thereby shifting your alertness and focus out of sync. Harvard Medical School 1. Physical movement and posture also act as context cues. When you get out of bed, stand up, open your eyes to ambient light, walk around, you are activating your body's arousal systems, cardiovascular, neuromuscular, metabolic. That activation interfaces with your brain's alertness circuits, helping to shift you into a more engaged state. On the other hand, sitting still in dim light, staring at screens without context, or exposing yourself to conflicting signals, lights at night, caffeine late in the day can decouple your brain from its optimal alertness rhythm. There's an important interplay between the circadian and homeostatic drives. The homeostatic drive accumulates the longer you're awake, the circadian drive oscillates. Early in the day, you benefit from low sleep pressure and a rising circadian alertness signal. Later, if you're still awake, homeostatic pressure increases and the circadian wake signal may decline depending on time and light environment, leading to dips in performance. Frontiers 4. This is why, for many people, the mid-afternoon slump or the late-night fade of alertness occurs even if sleep has been sufficient. The biology is operating. Recognizing this rhythm gives you a strategic advantage. Plan demanding cognitive tasks for when your alertness is biologically high, and schedule recovery, lower demand tasks for when the rhythm dips. To optimize alertness, you therefore take a twofold approach, align with your internal clock, and shape your environment accordingly. Practical stepping stones, wake around the same time every day. This keeps your clock entrained. Get natural light exposure within the first hour. Minimize bright or blue-rich light in the evening. Move your body soon after getting up. Avoid heavy meals or screens close to bedtime. And schedule your highest attention tasks when your alertness is at its peak. The environment you craft becomes a context cue. Your brain learns, now I'm in focus mode. Over time, the brain internalizes those cues and can more reliably shift into the desired state. It's worth emphasizing that individual differences matter. Chronotype, whether you're a morning person or evening person, prior sleep history, age, and genetic factors all reshape how your circadian and contextual cues manifest. What's peak for one person may differ for another. Nupsi key 3, so the approach is not one size fits all, but the underlying principle remains. By respecting your biology and engineering your context, you enhance your brain's ability to stay alert when it matters and rest when it doesn't. When you adopt this biology-informed framework, you shift from reacting, I need to power through, to proactively structuring your day with the natural rhythms your brain and body expect. In doing so, alertness doesn't remain a scarce commodity. It becomes a predictable tool. When you feel slightly off kilter, your mind wandering, your energy dipped, your clarity diminished, you don't always need a fancy tool or a pharmaceutical fix. You can actively shift your physiological state in real time using simple bodily levers. These tools engage your autonomic nervous system, your brain-body connectivity, and they're rooted in well-studied science. Let's explore how you can use them to steer your state toward focused, alert, and resilient. One of the most potent tools at your disposal is breathing. It's remarkable, a mechanism we often take for granted, yet one that exerts profound influence on brain and body. When you breathe shallowly, fast, through your chest, you're triggering a sympathetic arousal cascade. Heart rate rises, blood pressure may climb a bit. Your brain shifts towards scanning and reacting rather than steady focus. In contrast, when you slow your breath, engage your diaphragm, and elongate the exhale, you engage the parasympathetic system, your vagus nerve activates, your heart rate variability goes up, cortisol drops, and your brain can shift into calmer, clearer functioning. Research shows that deliberate breathing techniques, especially nasal inhalation, longer exhale phases, moderate pace, for instance, 5-6 breaths per minute, improve cognitive performance under stress, improve attention, and reduce emotional noise and respiratory centers, and can shift your alertness level in seconds. Science Direct 2. What these tools share is that they bypass conscious self-critique, I must concentrate harder, and go directly to the brain-body interface. You're not asking yourself to focus, you're putting your body in a state that allows and promotes focus. By doing the breathing, posture, movement, and perhaps sensory resetting, you change the baseline circuitry. Neuromodulators like norepinephrine, dopamine, acetylcholine, and the autonomic nervous system shift into patterns consistent with attentive, present, engaged brain states. Importantly, these tools are not one-time hacks, but can become reliable state switch levers if you train the association. Every time you do your breathing, stand up, reset your posture, adjust your sensory field before focus work, you're creating a learned pattern in your brain. This posture, breath, environment focus mode. Over time, your system more readily enters that state with less friction. Moreover, regardless of whether you're preparing for a deep session of writing, analytical thinking, creative work, or coming out of a fog or slump, you can apply these tools to shift your baseline and then proceed with higher fidelity attention. In sum, your physiology is not just the packaging containing your brain, it's an instrument you can tune. By leveraging breathing protocols, mindful posture plus movement, and environmental resets, you activate your brain's focus mechanisms rather than fight against them. If you adopt these tools consistently, you convert trying to focus into being able to focus, which is a fundamentally different operating mode. So let's bring this home. You're not just going to want to focus, you're going to know how to focus. You'll understand the chemical pathways, the visual system's role, the timing of your body, and the tools you have to flip the switch. By aligning your brain and body, you become your own focus engine. Thank you for joining me here on Brain Encoded. If you found value in this, hit like, subscribe, ring that notification bell. Let's build the kind of neural architecture where focus is not a struggle, but a skill you deploy. Stay sharp, stay present, and I'll see you next time.